The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, the kind of fragrance that clung to expensive sheets and quiet luxury. Holly stirred, her fingers grazing the fabric beneath her, silk, impossibly smooth. She opened her eyes, blinking against the soft glow of morning light spilling through sheer curtains. The ceiling stretched high above her, painted with delicate patterns. She wasn't home. Wherever she was, it was beautiful. And enormous. Her body felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. There was no stiffness from a lumpy mattress, no thin blanket barely covering her feet. Instead, there was warmth, comfort, an absurd sense of ease. The kind that didn't belong to her. She sat up too quickly, the rush of movement making her dizzy. The room was expansive, the walls a soft ivory, the furniture carved with details so fine she could never have afforded them. The sheets pooled around her waist as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. A velvet chaise in the corner, a vanity covered in delicate perfume bottles, a walk-in closet with an open door revealing rows of neatly arranged dresses in colors and fabrics she had never owned. A large window framed a view of perfectly manicured gardens. Then came the rustle of sheets beside her. A hand, warm and steady, brushed against her arm. Holly froze. She hadn't been alone. "Good morning, my love." The voice was smooth, deep, intimate in a way that sent a shiver through her. She turned her head slowly, already knowing that whoever she was about to see would make no sense. The man beside her was breathtaking in a way that belonged in magazines. Dark hair tousled from sleep, eyes a piercing shade of hazel, lips curved into a familiar smile, a smile she didn't recognize at all. He looked at her with a kind of ease that suggested this was normal. That she belonged here. That she belonged to him. Holly's heart slammed against her ribs. His fingers traced a path along her arm, absent-minded, as if this was something he had done 1,000 times before. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering for just a moment. She stopped breathing. This was wrong. Nothing about this was hers. The weight of his affection was too heavy, too real. Holly pulled back before she could think better of it, pressing herself against the towering headboard, fingers gripping the sheets as if they might anchor her. The movement made him pause. His brows furrowed slightly, a flicker of something, concern, crossing his face. "Holly?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Are you all right?" The sound of her name coming from him only made it worse. She forced herself to stay still, to think. There was a mistake. There had to be. This was a dream, or an elaborate prank, or some horrible trick her brain was playing. Her throat was dry. She needed to say something, anything, but every word lodged itself deep inside her. His head tilted slightly, studying her in the way someone does when they're trying to solve a puzzle. The room was silent except for the faint rustling of the sheets as he sat up, the warmth in his expression cooling just a fraction. "You look pale," he said, reaching out again, this time touching her cheek with the back of his hand, testing for a fever. "Do you feel sick?" Holly's skin burned where he touched her. She swallowed, hard. "Who are you?" The words came out hoarse, barely above a whisper, but they landed between them like a crack of thunder. His hand stilled against her face. Something in his expression faltered, then smoothed again so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. He let his hand drop and sat back against the pillows, regarding her with a quiet patience that made her even more nervous. "Very funny," he said, though there was no real amusement in his voice. She shook her head. I don't know you." The patience in his eyes sharpened into something more alert. He studied her, his lips parting slightly, as if waiting for her to say she was joking. But she wasn't. And the longer the silence stretched, the more the reality of this set in. Holly forced herself to take in more of the room, her mind racing. She had no memory of coming here. No recollection of meeting him. No explanation for why she was in this place, in this life, waking up beside a man who spoke to her like she was his world. "Holly," he said again, slower this time. His voice was careful, measured. "It's me. Scott." The name meant nothing to her. The panic returned, rising up her throat, threatening to choke her. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I don't know how I got here." Scott sat up fully now, reaching for her hand. She pulled it back before he could take it, and that, finally, seemed to unnerve him. His jaw tensed, his gaze flickering over her as if checking for injuries. "You don't remember me?" She shook her head, her pulse hammering. His breath came slower now, deeper, his composure slipping just slightly. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling sharply before looking at her again, a new kind of intensity in his expression. "All right," he said carefully, as if speaking too fast might shatter something fragile. Let's not panic. Maybe you're still waking up. Maybe you're just groggy." His reasoning made sense. It would have been comforting, even, if she didn't already know, with a certainty that clawed at her chest, that this was more than that. She wasn't groggy. She wasn't confused. She was in the wrong life. Her hands shook as she reached under the covers, gripping the edge of the sheets, grounding herself in the only real thing she could touch. Scott watched her, waiting, patient but alert. "I need a moment," she finally managed. "Of course," he said instantly. She felt him hesitate, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go. He didn't move. Holly turned her gaze toward the window, staring out at the unfamiliar world beyond it, searching for something, anything, that made sense. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of a world that had changed overnight, and the terrifying, inescapable truth that she had woken up in a life that wasn't hers. The floor was cold beneath her feet, the marble polished to a high shine that reflected the morning light spilling in through towering windows. Holly walked carefully, almost afraid to make a sound, as if acknowledging this place out loud would make it real. It was too much. Too perfect. Too extravagant in a way that didn't belong to her. She trailed a hand along the smooth railing of a grand staircase, her fingertips brushing against gold detailing, her pulse pounding as she took in the sheer size of it all. This wasn't a house. It was the kind of mansion people took tours through, the kind featured in magazines alongside headlines about wealth and legacy. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, chandeliers dripping crystals that caught the sunlight, casting tiny rainbows across the walls. She passed a sitting room with plush armchairs arranged neatly around a grand piano. A study lined with dark wooden bookshelves, filled with first editions that looked more decorative than read. Every room was pristine, curated like something out of a dream, yet there was no rush of recognition. No feeling of familiarity. The worst part was how easy it would have been to believe she belonged here. There were little signs of her everywhere, an open book on a side table, a silk robe draped across a chair, a coffee cup with a faint lipstick stain. She walked slowly, her pulse quickening as she reached the hallway leading to the grandest room yet, a sun-drenched sitting area with high arched windows and a fireplace taller than she was. Her gaze drifted to the walls, where neatly framed photographs hung in a precise arrangement. And there she was. Holly's breath caught in her throat. The pictures were beautiful, capturing frozen moments of a life she had no memory of. In one, she stood at a gala, her arm looped around Scott's, her dress glittering under the lights as they smiled for the cameras. Another showed them on a yacht, the ocean stretching endlessly behind them, her hair windswept as she leaned into him. There were images of vacations, parties, candlelit dinners, her face alight with happiness. She stared, searching for something, anything, that would trigger recognition. But it wasn't there. She wasn't there. It was her face, her body, her laughter, but it belonged to someone else. Someone who had lived this life, loved this man, smiled into these cameras like she had never known anything different. Her stomach turned. The sound of distant footsteps made her tense, and she turned just as Scott appeared at the entryway. "There you are," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something else. He was dressed now, the easy confidence in his posture making her pulse spike with anxiety. She forced herself to stay still, gripping the edge of the console table beside her. "I was looking for you," he continued, stepping closer. His gaze flickered to the wall, to the photos she had clearly been studying. "You always liked this room in the mornings." Holly swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to pretend, so she said nothing at all. Scott studied her, the way her fingers tightened against the polished wood, the tension in her shoulders. His brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't press her. Instead, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a familiarity that made her flinch. He stilled. Her reaction had been too obvious. "Come on," he said after a beat, his voice careful. "Let's have breakfast." She followed him through the winding halls, past more rooms she didn't recognize, more wealth that didn't belong to her. They entered a dining space that was both stunning and intimidating, sunlight streaming in through the glass doors that opened onto a sprawling terrace. The table was set elegantly, a spread of fresh fruit, eggs, toast, and coffee laid out like a hotel buffet. It was too much food for two people, but nothing about this house seemed built for moderation. Scott pulled out a chair for her, waiting. She hesitated before sitting, hands clasped tightly in her lap, unsure of how she was supposed to behave in a life that wasn't hers. He poured her coffee the way someone does when they've done it 100 times before. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. He set the cup in front of her without asking, completely unaware that she had no idea if this was how she took her coffee. "You're quiet this morning," he observed. Holly lifted the cup to her lips, if only to stall. She felt his gaze on her as she took a small sip, her stomach tightening when she realized he'd been right about how she liked it. "I didn't sleep well," she finally said. It wasn't a lie. Scott nodded slowly, his expression unreadable as he reached for his own coffee. She focused on the movement, on the steady way he stirred his drink, willing herself to stay calm. But then he said it. "You seem different." The word sent a chill through her, sharp and certain. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She looked up and met his eyes, searching for any sign that he knew. That he saw through her. That he realized something wasn't right. But he only studied her in that same careful way, as if waiting for an explanation. She forced a small smile, hoping it was the kind of expression this version of herself would wear. "I guess I just need some time to wake up." Scott held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, knowing smile. "Then let's take the day slowly," he said. Holly exhaled, nodding, pretending to relax. She reached for a piece of toast, her hands steady now. She would figure this out. She had to. The apartment was small, the kind that came with thin walls and a heater that worked only when it wanted to. The scent of baby powder lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee that had long gone cold on the counter. Martha moved through the cramped space, stepping over a pile of laundry she hadn't gotten to yet, balancing a squirming baby on her hip while using her free hand to grab a bottle from the sink. Samuel whined impatiently, his little fists curling and uncurling as she tested the milk on her wrist. "Hold on, bub," she murmured, rocking him slightly as she tilted the bottle to his lips. His face scrunched for a moment before he latched on, sighing contentedly. She exhaled, pressing a kiss to the top of his soft curls. He smelled like soap and sleep, like warmth and everything good in the world. The exhaustion in her bones settled for a brief moment as she sat down on the edge of the couch, bouncing him gently while he drank. The room around her was cluttered but lived in, baby toys scattered near the coffee table, a half-folded stack of laundry perched on the armrest. A peeling calendar on the wall had scribbled notes about extra shifts, bills due, reminders to buy diapers. It wasn't much. But it was theirs. The knock at the door startled her. She groaned, shifting Samuel to her shoulder as she stood. "If this is Mrs. Crawford asking about rent again, I swear." She opened the door to reveal her neighbor, Edith, standing in her worn-out robe, a cigarette dangling from her fingers despite the building's strict no-smoking policy. "Before you say no," Edith started, taking a long drag, "I need you to cover my shift tomorrow night. My niece is coming in, and I promised I'd take her out." Martha let her head fall against the doorframe. "I already worked a double yesterday." Edith shrugged. "So what's one more?" One more was another night of standing on her feet for hours, another day of missing bedtime, another moment stolen from Samuel's fleeting baby years. But one more also meant diapers. Formula. The electricity bill. Martha chewed the inside of her cheek. "Fine." Edith grinned, flicking ash into the hallway. "You're the best. And don't worry, you can owe me later." Martha snorted. She had yet to see Edith cash in a single favor. She closed the door with her foot, adjusting Samuel as he let out a sleepy sigh against her shoulder. Her body ached, her eyes burned, but none of it mattered when she looked down at him, his tiny fingers curled against her shirt. She pressed a hand to his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. This was all that mattered. By the time she got him to bed, she was running on nothing but fumes and determination. She stretched out next to him in their shared bed, listening to the hum of the old radiator, the distant sound of someone's television playing through the walls. Her alarm was set for 4:30 a.m., just enough time to drag herself out of bed, get ready, and hand Samuel off to the woman downstairs who watched him while she worked the morning shift. It was a routine so familiar she didn't have to think about it anymore. Tomorrow, she'd do it all over again. Martha ran a tired hand over her face, letting her eyes drift shut. When she opened them, it was raining. The streetlights cast a dim glow over the sidewalk, reflecting in the puddles collecting along the curb. The weight of Samuel in her arms was warm, grounding. She tucked his blanket higher around his cheeks, shielding him from the damp air. It was late. Too late. The bus had been delayed, and she had spent the last 30 minutes rocking Samuel back and forth in the empty shelter, waiting. She adjusted her bag over her shoulder, shifting him to her other hip as she stepped off the curb. Headlights. The sound of tires slicing through rainwater. A horn, long and sharp. A rush of movement, a flash of white-hot pain, the world tilting. Then nothing. The hum of the engine was smooth, nearly silent, as Scott steered the car down a tree-lined street. Holly sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers digging into her palm. She had barely spoken since they left the house. It wasn't nerves exactly, more like the overwhelming effort of pretending. Pretending to know where they were going. Pretending to be comfortable. Pretending that this was her life. Scott seemed relaxed, one hand resting on the wheel, the other adjusting the air conditioning. He had the kind of presence that made people instinctively trust him. That much was clear. He looked at ease, like a man driving through familiar streets with the woman he loved. The problem was, Holly wasn't that woman. "This place has the best cappuccino," Scott said, nodding toward a sleek cafe on the corner. "You used to say it was the only thing that made mornings bearable." Holly forced a smile. He was watching her, waiting for some sign of recognition. She turned toward the cafe as they passed it, willing something to click into place. But there was nothing. No memory of mornings spent sipping coffee at one of the little tables by the window. No faint recollection of sitting across from him, laughing at something he had said. It was just another building. Another piece of this life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She glanced at him, searching for disappointment on his face, but he only looked thoughtful, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "We can stop if you want," he offered. "No," she said quickly. "I'm not really in the mood for coffee." He nodded as if that made perfect sense, but she could feel his eyes flicker toward her once more before he turned his attention back to the road. A few minutes later, he slowed the car in front of a bookstore with enormous glass windows, the kind of place that looked charming in the way independent bookstores always did. A display in the front window featured carefully stacked hardcovers, a little chalkboard sign next to them announcing a book club selection. "You used to spend hours in there," Scott said. "Sometimes I'd have to come find you when they were closing." She stared at the store, at the warm glow of the lights inside. "Do you want to go in?" he asked. There was a gentle expectation in his voice, as though he believed that walking through those doors might be enough to wake up the part of her that was missing. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not today." Scott didn't argue, but she could feel his quiet curiosity growing, pressing in around them like a weight. They drove for a while longer, Scott pointing out places they had been together, places that were supposedly important. The restaurant where they had celebrated their last anniversary. The small flower shop where he had bought her orchids on their wedding day. A movie theater where they had once stayed through 3 screenings of the same film just because they didn't want the night to end. Holly tried to react the way she thought she should, nodding, offering small smiles, but it wasn't enough. Scott caught her slipping. The way she hesitated before responding to a simple question. The slight panic in her eyes when he mentioned a friend's name and she had no idea who they were. The way she never once looked at a place with recognition. She could tell he was piecing things together. Slowly, carefully. By the time they returned home, she felt like she had run a marathon. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. Holly moved food around on her plate, avoiding Scott's gaze as he sipped his wine. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, filling the space where conversation should have been. After they cleared the dishes, she retreated to the bedroom, pulling on a soft sweater before curling up in the armchair by the window. The mansion was still, the kind of quiet that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. A few minutes later, Scott appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He crossed the room and sank down onto the ottoman in front of her, resting his elbows on his knees. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he reached for her hands, lacing his fingers through hers. His touch was warm, grounding, but Holly resisted the urge to pull away. "Holly," he said softly. "What's wrong?" Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. There was no accusation in his voice. No anger. Just quiet concern. She could lie. She could tell him she was tired, that she wasn't feeling well, that she just needed time. But she had a feeling none of that would work anymore. Scott knew something was off. And now, he was waiting for her to explain. Holly pressed her fingers to her temples, inhaling sharply as the weight of it all crushed down on her. Scott hadn't moved, hadn't let go of her hands, his thumbs brushing over her skin in soft, patient strokes. The warmth should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like an anchor keeping her in a life that didn't belong to her. She pulled her hands away and stood abruptly, pacing to the other side of the room, fingers digging into her arms. The pressure of it, the sheer absurdity of what she was about to say, made her chest tighten. Scott stayed where he was, watching, waiting. His expression was open, concerned, but there was something else too, like he already knew she was about to say something he wouldn't understand. "I don't think I'm who you think I am." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Scott frowned, sitting up straighter. "Holly." "No," she cut in, shaking her head. "I know how it sounds. I do. But you keep telling me about this life, about our favorite places, our friends, the things I love, but I don't remember any of it. And it's not just that I forgot. It's not a blank space, Scott. There's something else." She hesitated, breath catching in her throat. "There's another life," she whispered. "I don't know how, or why, but I remember it. I remember being someone else. His brow furrowed, his concern deepening, but he didn't interrupt. I was Martha Brooks, she said, voice trembling. I lived in a tiny apartment that smelled like burnt coffee and baby powder. I worked long shifts, barely scraping by, but it didn't matter because I had a son. Samuel. He was everything. Scott's lips parted slightly, confusion flickering in his hazel eyes. I remember rocking him to sleep. I remember the weight of him in my arms, the sound of his laugh, the way his tiny fingers wrapped around mine. I remember the exhaustion, the love, the life we had together. And I remember the night it all ended. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to keep going. It was raining. I was carrying him home, crossing the street. And then, nothing. I woke up here. Scott let out a small breath, his hands clasped together as he processed what she had just said. She waited, pulse pounding, expecting him to laugh or tell her she was insane. Instead, he just studied her, his expression shifting from confusion to something much heavier. "Holly," he said slowly, carefully, like he was choosing each word with precision. "You were in an accident." She blinked. "You were hit by a car," he continued. "You suffered a head injury. You were in a coma for nearly a month." The air in the room seemed to thin. "You woke up 2 months ago," he added, standing now, his movements controlled, deliberate. "You've been recovering ever since." She shook her head. "No. That doesn't make sense. I remember everything." "I know." His voice was gentle, as if he were talking to someone on the edge of a breakdown. Maybe he was. "But, Holly, what you're describing, it's not real." She flinched. Scott exhaled and ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure slipping just a fraction. "Come with me," he said. She didn't move. "Please." Something about the way he said it made her legs obey, even as her mind screamed at her not to trust him. Scott led her down the hall, his steps measured, purposeful. They stopped at a small room she hadn't entered before. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, letting her go in first. The space was bright, modern, nothing like the rest of the house. A large wooden desk sat against the far wall, neatly arranged with paperwork. A bookshelf held an assortment of files, medical journals, and what looked like hospital discharge documents. Holly swallowed hard. Scott stepped past her and pulled a folder from the desk, flipping it open. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable as he held it out. She hesitated before taking it, her hands unsteady as she glanced down. Her name. Her real name, Holly Elliott, was printed at the top of the medical records. Dates, doctor's notes, test results. Her injury. The coma. The timeline. She scanned the pages, her breath coming shorter with each line. Everything was there, every detail matching what Scott had told her. The walls around her brain seemed to close in. She flipped through more pages, then stopped when she saw it, her hospital bracelet, taped to one of the documents. Her fingers brushed over it, the plastic smooth, clinical. It was real. Scott reached into the desk again and pulled out another item. A tablet. He tapped a few times before turning the screen toward her. A video. She pressed play. The image flickered, then stabilized. A hospital room. A woman, her, lying in a bed, pale, still, an oxygen tube taped under her nose. Machines beeped softly in the background. And Scott. Sitting beside the bed, his fingers curled around her limp hand. His face was exhausted, lined with something raw, something broken. She sucked in a breath. On the screen, Scott exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you can hear me. But if you can, I need you to come back to me, Holly." The video blurred as her vision swam. She set the tablet down with shaky hands, pressing her palm against her forehead as if that would somehow keep her from unraveling. Scott didn't move. The truth was sitting between them now, too heavy to ignore. Her fingers curled into her sweater. I don't understand. I think your mind is trying to fill in the blanks, Scott said gently. Memories can be unreliable after trauma. Maybe the life you remember is just a coping mechanism. He didn't say the words, but she heard them anyway. She shook her head, stepping back. But it felt real. I know. She wrapped her arms around herself, struggling to breathe. Scott took a cautious step closer. Holly, I love you. I would never lie to you. She wanted to believe him. She really did. The papers sat in her lap, edges slightly curled from the way she had been gripping them. Holly's eyes flicked over the printed words, her name, her birth date, medical terms she barely understood, charts showing her recovery. The official stamp of the hospital made it all feel heavier, more solid, like proof she hadn't asked for. She turned to the accident report next, the details stark and clinical. A sedan, late at night, low visibility due to rain. The impact had sent her body across the pavement, her head striking the ground hard enough to leave her unconscious. Emergency responders had arrived within minutes. She had been admitted to the hospital at 11:42 p.m. She traced the time with her finger, an ache building in her chest. Scott had been the one to sign off on her treatments, his name appearing over and over in the notes. Authorization for procedures. Requests for additional tests. A plea for updates from doctors. She flipped through another set of papers and found a discharge form. The date was 2 months ago. 2 months. The timeline was airtight. The records were undeniable. But it still didn't make sense. The weight of the papers was suffocating. She set them aside and pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes, trying to block out the rush of thoughts. Across from her, Scott sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, watching her carefully. He had barely spoken since handing her the folder, giving her space to absorb it all. His patience should have made her feel better, but it only made her more unsettled. Say something, he said finally. Holly lifted her head. I don't know what you want me to say. His jaw tensed, but he nodded. Okay. Then maybe this will help. He reached for the remote, pressing a button. A soft click, and then the television screen flickered to life. The video was grainy for a moment before it sharpened into something crystal clear. Holly sucked in a breath. It was a wedding. Not just any wedding. Hers. She was standing under a canopy of twinkling lights, wrapped in a gown so delicate it looked like it was made of clouds. Her dark hair was swept up, a few loose curls framing her face. She was laughing, tipping her head back slightly as Scott leaned in, his hand at the small of her back. The camera zoomed in, catching the exact moment he whispered something in her ear, the way her face softened, the way she reached up to touch his cheek like she had done it 1,000 times before. It was breathtaking. It was completely foreign. Holly felt cold all over, watching this woman who had her face but not her memories. The video cut to the first dance. The melody of a love song played softly in the background as she moved in Scott's arms, her cheek resting against his shoulder. They fit together so seamlessly, two people who had chosen each other. Scott picked up the remote and paused the video. Holly blinked at the frozen image of herself on the screen. Her fingers curled against her knees. That's you, he said quietly. She swallowed hard. That's us. Her heart pounded, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. This isn't a trick, Holly. This is our life. She exhaled slowly. I don't remember it. I know. His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. But just because you don't remember doesn't mean it didn't happen. She clenched her jaw, staring down at her hands, at the wedding band on her finger she hadn't even noticed until now. Scott leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His hazel eyes were warm but serious. If you can't trust your memories, trust me. Holly looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who had sat beside her in a hospital for weeks. The man who had carried her through every stage of recovery, who had waited for her to wake up. The man she had apparently once loved enough to marry. She wanted to believe him. She just didn't know how. Holly stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection as if it might offer some kind of answer. The woman staring back at her looked elegant, well-rested, like she had never known exhaustion. Her silk robe draped perfectly over her shoulders, her skin was smooth, untouched by stress. There were no dark circles beneath her eyes, no signs of sleepless nights spent rocking a baby, whispering lullabies in the dark. But that life had never happened. She gripped the edge of the marble counter, inhaling slowly, deliberately. Scott's words echoed in her mind, along with the doctor's notes, the hospital reports, the wedding video. This was real. The world she woke up in, the life she had built with him, it was hers. The other life was a dream. That was what she told herself as she stepped into the massive walk-in closet, fingers trailing over dresses she didn't remember picking out. She chose a soft sweater and a pair of tailored pants, clothes that fit perfectly, as if made just for her. Maybe they had been. Maybe she had loved this kind of life before, slipping into expensive fabrics, walking through a home that felt more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. Maybe she just had to learn to love it again. Scott was waiting for her in the dining room, reading the news on his tablet, a cup of coffee resting on the polished wood beside him. He looked up when she entered, smiling. "Morning." She nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. A plate of fruit and pastries had already been set out, as if the staff had memorized exactly what she liked. He studied her for a moment before setting the tablet aside. "How are you feeling?" She reached for a strawberry, turning it over between her fingers. "Better." It wasn't a lie, exactly. She wanted it to be true. Scott leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I was thinking we could go out today. Just walk around, get some fresh air. Maybe go to the museum?" She hesitated. "Or we could stay in," he added quickly. "Whatever you want." There was something so careful about the way he spoke to her, as if he was afraid one wrong word might send her spiraling again. She hated that. She forced a small smile. "The museum sounds nice." His relief was almost imperceptible, but she saw it. The day passed easily enough. She walked through exhibits that should have meant something to her, listened to Scott tell stories about past visits she didn't remember. She smiled in the right places, nodded at the right moments. It was fine. At least, it was until the night came. The first dream started softly, the kind that felt like slipping into warm water. Holly was back in her tiny apartment, surrounded by clutter and life. The air smelled like baby lotion, and the faint hum of the radiator filled the silence. She moved through the space like she belonged there, like she had never left. Then she heard it. A giggle. Small, sweet, familiar. She turned, and there he was, Samuel, sitting on the floor, reaching for her with chubby fingers. He looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, his tiny mouth forming the word that shattered her. "Mama." Holly jolted awake, her breath coming in uneven gasps. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow the wild rhythm of her heart. The room was dark, still. The silk sheets beneath her were cool, unfamiliar. She was here. Not there. She exhaled shakily, running a hand through her hair. It was just a dream. But it had felt real. She curled onto her side, squeezing her eyes shut. It didn't matter. It was just the intensity of the dream. Nothing more. The house had too many rooms. It wasn't just the size, though that was overwhelming on its own. It was the way every hallway seemed to lead to another door she hadn't noticed before. Every time she thought she had a sense of the place, she'd stumble across another sitting room, another study, another grand space designed for a life she didn't remember. It had become a habit, wandering through the mansion in the afternoons. Scott was often busy with work, and she preferred the quiet over pretending to read in the library or staring at her reflection in the endless mirrors. The staff moved around her like ghosts, polite but distant, never questioning when she drifted from one room to another, her fingers trailing along smooth wallpaper and polished wood. She had been following the curve of the west hallway when she saw it. A door, just like the others, but different in one key way. It was locked. She tested the knob again, frowning. None of the other doors had ever been locked before. Her pulse quickened as she glanced over her shoulder. No one was around. The logical thing would have been to ignore it. To tell herself that if she hadn't needed to go inside before, she didn't need to now. But logic had very little hold on her these days. She pressed her palm flat against the door, exhaling slowly. Then she stepped back, scanning the hall, before crouching down to check the lock. Scott kept an extra set of keys in his study. She had seen them once, tucked into a drawer when he was looking for something else. It took less than 5 minutes to retrieve them. Her fingers shook slightly as she slid the key into the lock. There was a soft click, and the door eased open. The scent hit her first. Soft, powdery, something faintly floral. The room was bathed in afternoon light, streaming through gauzy white curtains. It was smaller than most of the other rooms, but it didn't feel small, it felt intimate, delicate. A crib sat against the far wall. Holly stepped inside, her heart thudding against her ribs. She turned in slow circles, taking it in. The rocking chair near the window. The mobile above the crib, tiny silver stars frozen mid-spin. The bookshelf filled with children's books, their spines uncracked. It was beautiful. And untouched. Her breath came quicker now as she moved toward the crib. She reached out hesitantly, fingertips grazing the edge. A stuffed rabbit sat inside, its fur impossibly soft. She picked it up, holding it in her hands as something sharp and unfamiliar clawed at her chest. The memories weren't there. But the grief was. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her. Holly. Scott's voice was quiet, careful. She turned slowly, the rabbit still clutched in her hands. His face was pale, his hazel eyes filled with something unreadable. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled, like he was steadying himself. You weren't supposed to find this room. She felt like she was underwater, moving through something thick and heavy. Whose room is this? Scott's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His hands curled into fists at his sides before he forced them open. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Ours. She blinked. A strange ringing filled her ears. Scott took a slow step toward her, gaze flicking to the stuffed rabbit in her grip. His jaw tightened. You were pregnant, Holly. Something inside her cracked. She took a step back, shaking her head. No. His face twisted briefly, pain, regret, something deep and awful. You lost the baby in the accident. The words shattered the space between them. Her knees buckled. Scott was there before she could fall, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. Holly let out a strangled sound, not quite a sob, not quite anything she had words for. She pressed a hand against her stomach, trying to feel something, anything. But there was nothing. No memory of carrying a child. No weight of a loss she should have known. Just a void. I didn't tell you sooner, Scott murmured against her hair. Because I didn't want to break you again. She clutched his shirt, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Scott tightened his hold, one hand rubbing soothing circles against her back. I wanted to protect you. You'd already lost so much. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push past the emptiness, trying to grasp onto something real. But the only thing real in that moment was the steady rhythm of Scott's breathing, the warmth of his arms around her, the nursery that had been waiting behind a locked door. She understood now. This was why he had been so patient. He hadn't just been waiting for her to remember. He had been terrified of losing her twice. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its steady rhythm filling the quiet space between them. Holly sat on the couch, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on a tiny imperfection in the fabric of her sweater. The room smelled like lavender, faint and calming, probably intentional. The psychologist, Dr. Wallace, had one leg crossed over the other, her pen resting against the notepad on her knee. She had been watching Holly for a few minutes now, waiting, not pushing. You don't have to say anything until you're ready, Dr. Wallace offered gently. Holly exhaled through her nose. I don't know what to say. You've been through something unimaginable, Dr. Wallace said. That kind of loss doesn't just disappear. And when trauma is too big, too painful, our minds find ways to protect us from it. Holly finally looked up. You think I made it up? Dr. Wallace tilted her head slightly. I think it's possible that your grief, your injuries, the coma, it all collided in a way that made your brain create something more manageable. Another life. One where the baby you lost still existed. A hollow feeling settled in Holly's chest. It's not uncommon, Dr. Wallace continued. Sometimes, the mind shields itself by distorting memory. It's a way of coping. You were waking up to a world where you had lost so much. Maybe your mind gave you something else to hold on to. Holly sat with that for a long moment. The logic made sense. It was clinical, straightforward. A reasonable explanation for something that felt completely unreasonable. But if it was true, why did it still feel so real? She wrapped her arms around herself. So I just move on. Accept that I imagined it? Dr. Wallace's expression was kind, but firm. You accept that your grief is real. And that it doesn't have to define you. Scott was waiting for her in the car. He always offered to come inside, but she never let him. She needed this to be hers, something separate from the carefully curated life she was still trying to step into. She slid into the passenger seat, pulling her seatbelt across her lap as Scott turned down the radio. How was it? He asked. She looked out the window. Fine. He didn't push. He rarely did. The drive back was quiet, the city passing in a blur of movement and light. It had been weeks since she had stepped into therapy, since she had started doing what everyone around her thought was best. She told herself she believed it. That she was healing. That Dr. Wallace was right. She threw herself into the life she was supposed to have. She let Scott take her out, to the restaurants he said they used to love, the art gallery where they had once spent an entire afternoon arguing about modern installations. She let him hold her hand in public, wrap an arm around her when they stood too long in one place. She let herself ease into conversations at dinner parties, smiling when people told stories about memories she didn't share. She played the part of someone who was rebuilding. She ignored the weight in her chest when she walked past the locked nursery. She stopped bringing up the little boy she was convinced had once been hers. She told herself Samuel had never existed. She told herself she believed it. But the dreams didn't stop. They were softer now, quieter. She never saw herself, only him. His tiny hands reaching for something she couldn't see. His laughter floating through the air, warm and familiar. The weight of him curled against her chest, safe, steady. Every time she woke up, her arms ached with the absence of him. She kept it to herself. She had to. The house was silent except for the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Holly sat on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs, Scott's laptop balanced on her knees. The cursor blinked in the empty search bar, waiting. She shouldn't be doing this. Dr. Wallace had told her to let go. Scott had told her to trust the life she had woken up in. She had been trying, really trying, to convince herself that Samuel was just a dream, a construct of grief and trauma. That he had never been real. But if that were true, why did she still feel like something was missing? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She inhaled deeply, then typed. Martha Brooks. The search results loaded instantly. She almost didn't click. Almost closed the laptop and pretended she hadn't seen anything. But her hands moved before she could stop them, scrolling, scanning, until her eyes caught on something. A news article. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she clicked. Local woman in critical condition after hit-and-run accident. The article was dated 5 months ago. Holly's mouth went dry. She forced herself to keep reading. Martha Brooks, 27, was struck by a vehicle late last night while crossing an intersection on East Hanover Street. Witnesses say the victim was carrying a small child at the time of the accident. The child, a 1-year-old boy, was miraculously unharmed, but Brooks suffered severe head trauma and remains in critical condition at St. Vincent's Hospital. The words blurred. A child. Her fingers tightened around the laptop. She scrolled further, reading details that sent a chill down her spine. The accident had happened on a rainy night. Late. She checked the time stamp. 11:42 p.m. Her stomach twisted violently. That was the same night as her accident. The same time she had been admitted to the hospital. Her body was ice. Martha Brooks was real. She had been in a coma. And she had a son. Holly barely remembered getting into the car. She wasn't sure if she had grabbed her coat, if she had locked the front door, if Scott had called after her as she ran through the house. None of it mattered. Her hands were shaking against the steering wheel, her foot pressing too hard on the gas as she weaved through traffic, ignoring the angry horns and flashing lights. The name repeated in her head over and over. Martha Brooks. She had been real. She had existed, lived, breathed, had a child. And she had been in a coma. The hospital parking lot was full, but Holly pulled into the first empty space she saw, barely registering that it was reserved. She threw the car into park and sprinted toward the entrance, her breath coming fast and uneven as she pushed through the glass doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and sterile. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her forward. She reached the front desk, hands gripping the cool surface, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I need to see Martha Brooks," she said. "She was a patient here. Months ago." The woman behind the desk blinked, then frowned as she typed into the computer. Holly tapped her fingers against the counter, willing her to move faster. The nurse's expression changed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Martha Brooks passed away a few nights ago." Holly swayed on her feet. The walls around her seemed to shift, the sounds of the hospital muffled, distant. A few nights ago. The same night she had dreamed of Samuel again, of his laughter, of his tiny hands reaching for her. The night she had woken up with the unshakable feeling that something had changed. Her fingers curled against the desk. "Are you sure?" The nurse gave her a sympathetic look. "Yes." She had been in a coma for months. "I'm so sorry." Holly took a step back, then another. She felt cold all over, like the air in the hospital had turned to ice. She had never met Martha Brooks. Never spoken to her. But somehow, she felt the loss of her like a blow to the chest. A hand touched her arm, pulling her out of the haze. She turned to see a woman in a navy blue blazer, a hospital badge clipped to her pocket. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said gently. "Did you know Martha?" Holly opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The woman softened. "I'm Julia. I'm a social worker here at St. Vincent's." Martha didn't have any family listed on her records. "Were you a friend of hers?" Holly still couldn't answer. The room felt too bright, too sharp. Julia studied her face for a moment, then sighed. "I've been handling her case," she continued. "She was admitted after a car accident. There was a baby involved." Holly's breath hitched. Julia didn't seem to notice the way her entire body locked up. She glanced down at the file in her hands, flipping through the pages. The child wasn't injured, but since Martha had no family, he was placed into foster care. Holly's heart stopped. Julia glanced up. Holly barely heard herself speak. "Martha had a baby?" Julia nodded. "Yes. A little boy, Samuel." Holly felt weightless, like the floor had disappeared beneath her. The words hung in the air, sharp and impossible. Martha's son, Samuel, was in foster care. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, trying to steady herself. The hospital noise faded, the beeping monitors, the shuffle of footsteps, the distant hum of conversation. None of it mattered. Julia, the social worker, was still speaking, flipping through papers, unaware that Holly's entire world had just tilted on its axis. "He's a beautiful boy," Julia said. "Healthy, bright. He was lucky, there were no injuries from the accident." The sound that left Holly's throat was barely audible. A breath, a gasp, something raw and aching. She had seen him. In dreams, in flashes, in moments so vivid they had left her shaken. Samuel. Not imagined. Not a fragment of grief or trauma. Real. Julia glanced up from the file, frowning slightly. "Are you all right?" Holly pressed a hand to her stomach, trying to ground herself. Her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "Did you say Samuel?" Julia nodded, flipping back to the top page of the file. "Yes. Samuel Brooks. He's been in the system since Martha was admitted." The name hit her like a physical force. The name she had whispered in the dark, the name that had echoed through every dream, every restless night. Julia was watching her now, curiosity creeping into her expression. "Did you know Martha?" she asked. Holly's lips parted, but she didn't know what to say. She had never met Martha Brooks. She had no connection to her, no reason to be standing here, shaking at the sound of her child's name. But somehow, impossibly, their lives had intertwined. Julia's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning Holly's face, reading something in her silence. "Were you related to Martha?" she asked carefully. Holly exhaled sharply. She had no answer. No logical explanation. All she knew was that her entire body was screaming that this little boy, Martha's son, Samuel, was supposed to be hers. Holly's hands trembled at her sides, her pulse hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. The words barely made it past her lips. "Is he up for adoption?" Julia's eyes flickered with something: surprise, curiosity, hesitation. She adjusted the file in her hands, glancing down at the papers as if the answer might be different than the one she already knew. "Yes," she said carefully. "He has no known relatives." Holly's knees nearly buckled. Her hands flew to her face, covering her mouth, trying to hold in the sob that was already rising in her chest. A wave of relief, sharp and dizzying, crashed over her, but it was tangled with something deeper. Something heavier. She was crying before she could stop herself. Not just tears, a complete unraveling. She pressed her hands to her eyes, as if blocking out the room would somehow slow the flood of emotions tearing through her. Julia reached out instinctively, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" Holly let out a strangled laugh, shaking her head. "No. I don't think I am." Julia hesitated, her concern deepening. "Did you know Martha?" Holly exhaled shakily, dropping her hands from her face. "No." Julia frowned. "Then I don't understand." Neither did Holly. There was no logic to this. No explanation that made sense. All she knew was that the moment she heard Samuel's name, something inside her snapped into place. She had spent months trying to convince herself that he wasn't real. That the dreams, the memories, the aching pull toward a child she had never held were just manifestations of grief. But they weren't. He was real. He had always been real. Julia was still watching her, waiting for an answer, for something that would make sense. Holly wiped at her wet cheeks and took a deep, unsteady breath. "How do I adopt him?" Julia's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look shocked. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this. "We can talk about that," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But first, I need to understand. Why do you want to?" Holly blinked through the lingering tears, her breath still uneven, her heart still racing. How could she possibly explain? That she had dreamed of him before she knew he existed. That she had spent months waking up with the phantom feeling of a child in her arms. That she had lost a baby she never got to know, and somehow, this little boy had found his way to her. She didn't have the words. All she had was the truth, raw and undeniable. "Because," she whispered, voice breaking, "I think he was always supposed to be mine." Holly sat in the passenger seat, gripping the hem of her sweater so tightly the fabric twisted under her fingers. The ride home from the hospital had been a blur. She hadn't spoken since she slid into the car, hadn't even looked at Scott, too consumed by the storm in her head. She didn't know how to explain it. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to try. Scott pulled into the long driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel. The house loomed ahead, golden light spilling from the tall windows, warm and inviting. It should have felt like home. Instead, all she could think about was a little boy somewhere out there, alone, waiting for someone to bring him home instead. Scott parked the car and turned off the engine, but he didn't move. Holly felt his gaze on her, waiting, patient as always. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I need to tell you something," she said finally. His brows furrowed slightly. "All right." Holly inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I went to the hospital today." Scott's expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of concern behind his eyes. "Why?" She opened her mouth, hesitated, then exhaled. "I was looking for someone." A pause. "Who?" She gripped her hands together. Her name was Martha Brooks. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Scott waited, his patience making it both easier and harder to continue. "She was in a car accident," Holly said quietly. "The same night I was." "The same time." Scott's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing. "She was in a coma for months." Holly swallowed. "She passed away a few nights ago." Scott leaned back slightly, absorbing her words. Holly clenched her hands tighter, bracing herself. "She had a son." His expression shifted, confusion flickering over his face. "A son?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "A little boy. His name is Samuel." Scott tilted his head slightly, watching her carefully. Holly, why were you looking for her? The question hit her like a weight. She should have had an answer. A logical one, something that made sense, something that didn't sound like she was unraveling. But there was nothing logical about this. She forced herself to hold his gaze. Because I already knew his name before today. Scott stilled. The air between them shifted, thickened. Holly forced herself to keep going. I thought he wasn't real. I thought he was just, she shook her head. A dream. A memory I made up. But he's real, Scott. He's real. He didn't look away. Didn't blink. And then, after a long moment, he spoke. Maybe this isn't about logic, he said quietly. Maybe this is about love. Holly's breath caught. She had expected resistance. Skepticism. She had prepared for the way he might try to talk her down, tell her she was overwhelmed, that she was seeing connections that weren't there. She had never expected this. Her fingers trembled against her lap. You believe me? Scott exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what I believe. He turned toward her fully. But I know you. She swallowed. You've been trying so hard to move on, he said, voice softer now. To convince yourself that the past you remember wasn't real. But Holly, he reached for her hand, curling his fingers around hers. What if this isn't about what's real and what isn't? What if this is just what's meant to be? Her chest tightened. Scott's thumb brushed against her skin. If you want to do this, if you want to bring him home, I'll support you. Holly closed her eyes, exhaling sharply. And for the first time in months, she felt something like relief. The agency office smelled like printer ink and old carpet, the kind of place where people's lives changed with a few signatures. Holly sat in a stiff plastic chair, her fingers twisting in her lap, her knee bouncing with nervous energy. Scott sat beside her, silent, steady, his warmth grounding her even as her entire body felt like it might lift off the floor. They had been here for almost an hour. Meetings, paperwork, signatures. She had nodded at everything, agreed to everything, barely hearing a word. The only thing she had truly understood was that Samuel was here. In this building. Just a few doors away. A woman in a navy blazer, her badge clipped to her pocket, appeared in the doorway, offering a gentle smile. Are you ready? Holly's breath hitched. She wasn't sure how to answer that. She stood on shaky legs, following the woman down a quiet hallway, Scott at her side. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something unspoken. They stopped in front of a door. Take your time, the woman said softly before opening it. Holly stepped inside. The room was small, just a couch, a rug, a bin of toys in the corner. And sitting in the middle of it, surrounded by blocks and stuffed animals, was him. Samuel. His little legs were sprawled out in front of him, his fingers wrapped around a toy truck. He was smaller than she had pictured, but exactly the same. The same round cheeks, the same mess of soft curls, the same wide brown eyes that she had seen 100 times in her dreams. He looked up. Holly's heart stopped. The social worker said something, an introduction, maybe, but Holly barely heard it. Samuel stared at her, his tiny mouth parting slightly, his fingers slowly uncurled from the truck. His gaze was steady, curious, like he was trying to place her. Holly took a step forward, then another. Her knees almost gave out beneath her as she lowered herself to the rug, her hands trembling. Hi, sweetheart, she whispered. Samuel blinked. Then, slowly, he reached for her. Holly let out a sob so raw it barely sounded human. She scooped him up, pressing his tiny body against her chest, her arms tightening around him as if she could somehow make up for all the time they had lost. His fingers curled into her sweater, gripping her like he had been waiting, like he had always been waiting. She buried her face in his soft curls, her shoulders shaking as she cried into his tiny shoulder, whispering, "I've got you. I've got you." Behind her, Scott stood quietly, watching. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Because in that moment, he understood. This was always meant to happen. Holly's hand shook slightly as she pressed the pen to paper, the ink bleeding into the crisp white page. She wrote her name, once, twice, again and again, signing on every dotted line, each stroke pulling Samuel closer to her. The final signature landed with a quiet finality, the weight of it sinking deep into her bones. She set the pen down carefully, her breath catching as she stared at the stack of documents in front of her. "That's it," the social worker said, her voice warm. "It's official." Holly exhaled, a sound that was part relief, part disbelief. She had thought this moment would come with a sense of victory, a feeling of triumph. But instead, all she felt was something softer, something she didn't have words for. Like a piece of her had finally fallen into place. She glanced over at Samuel, sitting on Scott's lap, his tiny fingers curled around one of Scott's larger ones. He had been so quiet during the meeting, his wide brown eyes bouncing between the adults, watching, absorbing, waiting. Scott caught her gaze, his expression unreadable, but his hands settled on Samuel's back, a silent reassurance. Holly turned back to the social worker. "So we can take him home now?" The woman smiled. "You can take him home." The ride back to the mansion was surreal. Holly sat in the back seat with Samuel, who had drifted off somewhere between the agency parking lot and the highway. His little head rested against her arm, his breath warm against her sweater. She stared down at him, overwhelmed by the simple fact that he was here. Scott drove without speaking, giving her space, letting her exist in this moment without interruption. The house was quiet when they arrived, the usual presence of staff kept to the background. Holly carried Samuel inside, adjusting him in her arms as she stepped through the grand front doors. It didn't escape her that this was a house built for elegance, not for baby toys and sticky fingers. But maybe that would change. Maybe everything would. She climbed the stairs slowly, her steps careful, purposeful. Scott followed behind, a steady presence, not interfering, just there. The nursery door, once locked, stood open now. Holly walked inside, adjusting Samuel's weight against her shoulder. The room was untouched, frozen in time. The crib sat waiting, the rocking chair still positioned near the window, the tiny bookshelf lined with books that had never been read. She shifted, pressing a kiss to Samuel's soft curls before laying him down. He stirred slightly, his small fingers twitching, before settling into sleep. She pulled the blanket up to his chin, tucking him in carefully, smoothing her palm over his back. Then, in the softest whisper, she said, "Your mama found you." She didn't move for a long time. Scott stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't speak, but when she finally turned to him, she saw it in his eyes. He understood. Maybe Martha had been searching for someone to love Samuel after she was gone. And maybe Holly, who had lost a child of her own, had been the perfect choice.